So finally, what we need to think about is how land rights are acquired. How do men and women acquire land? How does it differ? And by understanding that, we can start to think about how we might strengthen and also protect women's land rights. So there's four broad sets of ways that people acquire land. The first one is through the family, either through marriage or inheritance. You can acquire land through the market by purchasing it. You can acquire land from the state, so there could be land reform programs, land titling programs where the state allocates land. And finally, there's customary procedures for obtaining land, often through your community or your clan. And all four of these, the family, the market, the state, and customary, are all conditioned by gender. We need to think about the gender implications for all four of these. So let's start with thinking about the family. And when we think about the family, we need to think about two things: marriage and inheritance. When we think about marriage, we need to think about the marital regimes, which are the specific laws and rules about the ownership and management of property during marriage, and then what happens when the marriage dissolves, either through death, divorce, or separation. Broadly speaking, we can think about three types of marital regimes. The first one is full community property. And under this, all property owned by either the husband or the wife is jointly owned by both of them. There is no individual property for one of them. Everything is joint. Under the second regime, partial community property, everything that's acquired during marriage is joint property. So any land that you buy while you're married, if you buy your house while you're married, that is joint property. Anything that you bring to the marriage or that you inherit can be considered separate and individual property. And the third set of laws is a separation of property in which husbands and wives have their own property, and that simply by being married doesn't necessarily mean that you share property at all. These three have very different implications for women. In particular, the extent to which there is community property means that women are much more likely to own property because they own it jointly with their husband. Because they're more likely to take time out of the workforce, earn less money, they're less likely to be able to purchase land themselves, and so sharing it with their husband gives them much more land ownership. In terms of inheritance, there's two key issues regarding inheritance that make a difference. One is whether there's testamentary freedom or whether there's restrictions. What this means is, does the law allow you to freely will your property to whomever you choose, or are there rules about who you must will your property to? So in some situations, there's some fraction of your property that you must will to your children or your spouse, and then you have a smaller amount that you can choose who to will it to. In other situations, you can will it to anybody that you like. The second issue is about what happens when you don't have a will. How does the state, or in some contexts, how do social norms decide who receives your property? So we mentioned this at the beginning, but this, particularly in these issues around family, the issues around the formal laws and the social norms can really vary. So it's often the case that there are formal laws on the books about marital property and about inheritance, and they may not match up with the social norms, and the social norms may actually have a stronger influence on what happens. These inheritance rules are affected by gender in two ways. One, it matters whether or not children inherit irrespective of sex. Do sons and daughters inherit equally? And the second one is about whether the surviving spouse inherits anything. So there are situations in which property is separately owned by husbands and wives may not have any right to inherit when their husband dies. Those are the situations in which women are most disadvantaged. The combination of marital regime and inheritance regime that is most beneficial for women is one in which they're community property, so that when the husband dies, half the property is already hers, and where she still inherits part of what he had. So that's the other extreme, which is the best for women. So this graph again shows data from Ecuador, Ghana, and Karnataka, India. I had said earlier that we would come back and try to understand some of the patterns that we had seen. And this graph shows us the share of married couple wealth that is owned by women. Married couple in Ecuador also and in Ghana also includes those in consensual unions. The value of any land that is owned jointly by husbands and wives for these calculations is divided equally between them. So that if all property was owned jointly by men and women, we would see that women owned 50% of the property. What we find is that women in Ecuador own a much higher share of the couple wealth than women in either Karnataka or Ghana. And the explanations for this are that the marital regime in Ecuador is a partial community property regime, so that women share in marital property. They also have much more gender equal inheritance rights in Ecuador than in either of the other two countries. In both Karnataka and in Ghana, the marital property regime is one of separation of property, where husbands and wives individually own property. And what we see is that wives own a much, much smaller share. In terms of market acquisition, we would expect that men and women have different ways of acquiring land through the market. First of all, men and women have different earning ability in the workforce. Women earn less than men almost everywhere, and also spend less of their adult life in the labor force. Forms of non-labor income, so it could be remittances, it could be government transfers, other forms of income, may also differ by gender. Remittances may go to the husband or to the wife. Government transfers may be targeted to one or the other, but those may differ. There may also be social norms about what's appropriate for men and women to purchase, so that there may be social norms about what women have to spend their money on that may be different from the expectations for men. It may also be the case in some places such as Uganda, where when women start to save money and buy a piece of land on their own, particularly if it's a married woman, it's seen socially as that what she's doing is she's preparing to leave her husband. And so buying your own piece of property is seen as something that you would only do if you're a bad wife. And so there's real strong social norms against doing so. Finally, access to credit for buying land may really differ by men and women. And typically women have less access to credit generally, but certainly they have less access to credit for major purchases such as land. Governments affect land ownership through a number of kinds of programs. They may be titling programs or land reform programs. There's been a number of recent land reform programs implemented in Africa. One of them, the Ethiopian Land Registration System, is one in which they provide documentation of property rights, in which you don't technically own the land, but it can be rented. It can't be sold or used for collateral. But the Ethiopia case is one that's an example of fairly low-cost land registration that confers some rights on people and that benefits both the poor, and also they've made a real effort to make sure that it benefits women. Land formalization or land titling programs have the potential to really exclude women, and there's been a lot of concern about this. One reason is that when you bundle all of the land rights together under one person, then the rights that others, particularly women, may have had are lost. They no longer have those rights because all the rights are given to one particular person. It's also often the case that when men and women would say that they own land jointly, it may not be titled in both of their names. Within these kinds of recent programs, there's been some key lessons that have been learned for how to make sure that women do benefit from these kinds of programs. One is that the local land administrators really must be trained. Those are the people who are actually on the ground doing the titling, and they're the ones who really need to understand that the names of both men and women need to go on the titles. So just putting in the rules at the top to say that that's what has to happen isn't effective unless those local people doing the implementation understand the policy. The second thing that's really key and really simple is to make sure that on all of these documents, all of these ownership documents, there are spaces for at least 2 names. If there's only space for 1 name to be listed, it's almost always the case that it's the man's name in the household rather than the woman's name. When you put 2 lines, it's much more likely that both the man and the woman's name will be listed. There's also been some interesting ways that countries have gone about trying to make sure that women's rights are recognized, which is particularly challenging in places where there's no formal documentation of marriage, there may be no formal identity cards, and so proving whose name that is on the document may be difficult. And one of them, which they did in Ethiopia, is to actually include photos of the owners on the land certificate so that it's clear that there's a woman and which particular woman is one of the people on the document. So this table shows us how land was acquired in countries in Latin America. For example, what we see is that for the women who own land in Brazil, 54% of them inherited it and 37% of them purchased it. We see a quite different pattern for men in Brazil. 22% inherited it and 73% purchased it. The patterns differ from country to country, but in all of them except Ecuador, women are much more likely to have inherited their land than to have purchased it. So what does this mean in terms of projects and in terms of programming? It means a couple of things. First of all, the data on women's land ownership and women's property rights is still fairly limited. We need both good survey data that asks questions about who owns the land and what the rights are, and we also need good qualitative data to really understand what that means in a local context. So understanding who owns the property, what the property rights are, how they're allocated is really key before any project gets started. It's then also really important to think about what the potential impacts of a given project might be on property rights. So that, for example, a project that increases the value of land, so that if what you're doing is you're increasing agricultural productivity or increasing access to markets for agricultural produce in a particular area, that's going to increase the value of land. And if women's property rights are not secure, it means that women are much more likely to lose the rights that they have. So finding ways to secure women's property rights before putting these kinds of programs in place is really key. We also always want to keep in mind in thinking about how women might lose their property rights, that they really face challenges on 2 different levels. First of all, women face the same challenges to their property rights that everybody else in a community faces. They face the same rights that everybody else in their household faces. So that if their community is at risk from losing land due to large-scale land acquisitions, both men and women are going to lose the land. But women face challenges on another level as well. And that is that they may face challenges of losing their land from within their household and within their community. If they're not seen as being the owners of the land or having rights to it, then again, when the household dissolves, when something happens, they may be the ones who no longer have access to it. So they face this dual challenge in terms of keeping their land rights. So finally, to conclude, we've really seen 3 things today. 1, that women are much less likely to own land, and that they also own smaller amounts of land than do men. In addition, when we think about that bundle of property rights, women, even when they own land, are likely to have fewer rights on that land. In addition, women's property rights are important, both for their own well-being, that of their households and their children, and women's property rights are also important for their role in agricultural production. And finally, men and women acquire property rights and land through different channels. And so if we're trying to find policies that will strengthen women's land rights and give women more access to land, we need to understand how these patterns differ for men and women, and to see the barriers in particular that women face in the market to acquiring land. Great. Thank you very much.